So the crowds said to Jesus, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The word of the Lord. Now I got to see if this turned out or not. All right. Did that all by myself. Yeah. When I worked in landscaping, it was one of those jobs where you were always on the road. You were always on the go somewhere. And that meant we would typically pack lunches or dinners. What's the noontime meal? Okay. See, I thought so. What? Supper. The noon meal. Anyway, being the fresh out of college 22-year-old living on my own that I was, you can probably imagine what those packed lunches looked like. I mean, basically, picture the lunch you would pack for a kindergartner. It was peanut butter and jelly, string cheese, chips, cookies, and if I was feeling really responsible, maybe some carrot slices. So we would be out on the job, and in contrast to my lunch, the guys who worked on my crew, who were all from El Salvador, all brought hot meals that they had purchased that morning before work from the women in their neighborhood who cooked for them. So they had hot homemade tortillas, they had rice and veggies, they always had some kind of meat, chicken, pork, shrimp, something, every day. I must have looked really pathetic sitting there eating my PB&J because quite often they would share some of their food with me, which was awesome. A hot homemade meal is always better than soggy peanut butter and jelly. Looking back at all of that, I was either really rude in not offering anything back to them, or I didn't want them to laugh at me because I knew full well they had no interest in anything that I brought. But they always seemed to offer and share their food with no expectation of anything in return. Throughout this season of Lent, we've been going on a journey in the wilderness on our Saturdays and Sundays. We've been spending that time recognizing the times and the places and the events in our lives where we find ourselves in the wilderness. And we've been asking, where is God in that? And we're looking for God in the wilderness. But then now on Wednesday nights, I thought it would be an interesting contrast to explore where and how God shows up, not out in the wilderness, but in our normal everyday lives, in everyday objects. I want us to remember how God shows up in the mundane and how God can make the mundane holy. Because that's what Jesus came to do, right? He came to put flesh and bone on the divine. He came to take ordinary objects and put them to extraordinary uses, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, blessing the outcast, revealing God's kingdom. And because of what all Jesus has done, we have been taught to see the divine all around us. And not just see it and see what is holy, but hear what is holy, touch what is holy, smell what is holy, even taste what is holy. I'm really glad that turned out. It was a total crapshoot. Kim and I are very new at this bread baking thing, and she has been taught how to make bread. I never have, so I bought the bread maker because it kind of does it for you. And I thought it'd be nice just to have fresh bread every now and then. And because with apologies to those who have gluten sensitivities and to those who might have given it up for Lent, bread seems to be such a foundational food in this world. Right? Just think about how much bread is used in the Bible. We heard God uses bread, the manna from heaven, as a way to show God's faithfulness to those wandering Israelites, providing them with just enough to keep them filled as long as they obey God's commands. If you were here this past weekend, or you heard our gospel story, was where Jesus was being tempted by the devil, and that first offer, the first temptation that the devil made to Jesus was in his deepest hunger. Turn these stones into bread. And then later, after the wilderness for Jesus, he goes up the mountain and he teaches us that when we pray, we are to ask God, our Father, to provide us with that daily bread, all the things we need to sustain our lives. There are multiple stories where Jesus feeds the crowds of thousands with loaves of bread and a few fish. We've heard Jesus say that he is the bread of life. That is just a slice of the stories about bread in the Bible. Get it? So what is it with bread? Other than the fact that it smells really, really good, I think it's used so much by God because it's such a common and ordinary, yet extremely important part of our everyday world. Bread, in some form or another, is a main staple of nearly every culture in this world. Think back to those Israelites. While they were wandering in the wilderness, lost and starving, the things that they craved most were water and bread. And as we heard, God provided that for them every morning, day after day after day, in order that they might survive. But what can happen if something becomes that regular and predictable? We can start to take things for granted. So remember the lunches I was telling my guys would share with me while we were working? After a while of them doing that, I started to pack less and less in my lunch because I just kind of assumed they'd give me some of theirs. But there were still days where they didn't offer me anything. And I just sat there with the mopey look on my face in my PB&J, wondering why they weren't sharing that day. That's pretty pathetic, isn't it? I became so ungrateful instead of being thankful. How often then do we forget that our everyday bread from heaven is worth rejoicing over every day? How often do we forget that everything we have is a gift from God? How often do we forget that everything we have, even things as mundane and ordinary as plain old bread, is holy and can be used to show God's presence and love in this world and can be signs of God's kingdom among us? When we gather, whether it be on the job site or for a meal, we should see God's holiness among us and be thankful. But as we think about meals, I have to tell you something about my dog. The last time I took our dog to the vet for his annual checkup, I was told that he was overweight. That's why I don't go to the doctor. But the vet asked me, he said, does he get table scraps? Yeah, of course he does. So the vet told me that either we need to lay off the table scraps or we need to cut back on his regular food. So we cut back on his regular food, of course, right? Because He's our very own Roomba. You know, people who have kids and don't have a dog, I don't know how you do it. I mean, there was one time we were getting ready to leave town, and we were going to leave really early in the morning, so we took the dog to the kennel the day before. And that night, as we were having dinner, we spilled some food off of our plate as we were carrying it. And we went and sat down, and we ate, and we came back to the kitchen, and it was still on the floor. I mean, how's that work? I had to go find a broom, for Pete's sake. Do you recall a story, then, from the Gospel of Mark? It was about a Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was plagued with an unclean spirit. Jesus had just arrived to a house, and this woman sought him out, and she found him. She went and she bowed down by his feet, and she begged him to heal her daughter. And we hear that Jesus' response to her was, "Let the children eat first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Do you remember that story, maybe? What was her response back to Jesus? "Sir, even the dogs eat the crumbs under the table from the children." We sometimes think that in order to be satisfied, we have to have the whole loaf. We have to have as much daily bread as will fit on our plate. We forget that sometimes crumbs are enough. We forget that even crumbs can bring dignity to those whom we deem to be unworthy. We forget that even in the crumbs, we can experience the holiness and the blessedness of God. We can experience God in this ordinary stuff. Again, whether a simple packed lunch or a fancy dinner table, or when we break bread together in remembrance of the one who truly turns the ordinary into the extraordinary. When we gather at Christ's table, that ordinary bread suddenly gives us a foretaste of the heavenly banquet that is to come. Through something as simple as bread, we can know that God is with us and that God is present with us in plain sight everywhere. Amen.